So in conclusion, we do know cats can learn. They do use the same types of learning as other species. Their training sessions might be a little shorter, and the time between repetitions might be a little bit longer. But really, other than that, as long as we have a primary reinforcement that the cat likes, we can use these same techniques. Just as with dogs, cats, horses, or other species, positive reinforcement is really the most humane and safe type of training to use. And their behavior can be modified. You can manage them to avoid unwanted behavior, and we can reinforce desired behavior instead. The training and behavior modification not only helps to address an unwanted behavior, but it also helps to act as a source of enrichment and can increase adoption and success in a new home. And with that, I want to leave you with a couple of references and resources for you, and a lot of these are going to be found in addition to our material here, and I'll let Lynn fill in the details of where this is going to be for you. And we'll try to get the information for the Center for Shelter Dogs as well.
This will be in your resource widget at the bottom of your screen. It will also be on our website after this webcast. I also would like to initially first thanks Dr. Bennett, and I want to get to some questions. I know we're right at the top of the hour, and we're supposed to end at the top of the hour, but I know you're very interested in some of these questions that you've been submitting, and there have been a lot of them. So we'll do that next. I wanted to remind you that if you're having litter box problems, we have a video from Purdue University in our conference recordings called Curing the Litter Box Blues. So if you go to our website at www.maddiesinstitute.org, you can find that under conference recordings. So let's take our first question from the audience. Can flooding apply to socialization of feral kittens?
That is a fantastic question. It absolutely can. There is a fine line between systematic desensitization and flooding, and it all relies on the intensity of these situations. So we can tip into flooding very easily, particularly if we have a very low threshold of relaxation. So trying to socialize, and socialize is in quotation marks here, by putting these kittens or other animals into the situation that might be potentially frightening could very easily tip into flooding. Key is to remember to avoid flooding and to maintain systematic desensitization, is to watch the body language, and if the animal is frightened, you have to decrease the intensity of whatever is going on in that situation. The other thing to watch for is look at the interest in whatever you're using to positively reinforce that calm, relaxed behavior. If their interest starts to drop in it, they're not seeking out the food, they stop taking treats, they start to shy away from the petting if you're using petting, that tells you that whatever's going on at that moment is too frightening and we need to back off. That's a great question.
Okay, and here's the next question. And it reads, resident cat hisses and growls at the sight of the new cat. New cat respected and retreated for months, but now reacts and charges her. I cannot force them to eat together. They will wait me out. How do I get them to be in the same room?
This is another good question, and this is something that we run into, unfortunately, all too frequently. So what probably has happened is that the new cat who is trying to be respectful and retreating for months has now started to develop some learned fear of the resident cat. Given that you're saying that you cannot force them to eat together, what I suspect is happening is that the distance is too small. And so we have to look at a way to minimize the trigger of the other cat. And ways to do that are to feed them on opposite sides of a shut door. Perhaps we do some carrier training, and if the carrier is not scary, we put the carriers on opposite ends of the room, maybe covered so that they feel a little bit more safe. They have their hiding space, and see if they'll eat at that point. If they're not going to eat at those types of points, if you can't get them to eat, 10 feet away on opposite sides of the door, you probably need to talk to somebody, a veterinarian who's got a special interest in behavior or the specialist in behavior to help you out with this problem, because it may be a little bit bigger than just needing to do some desensitization. We may have to get a little bit more comprehensive with the behavior plan.
Thank you. Let's take another question here. Tips on how to stop a cat from biting. Georgie bites often, and not from overstimulus. You can pet him once and he'll bite. Learned at a young age with boys that played rough with him. How can he unlearn biting behavior?
So there's lots of different motivations for a cat to bite, and we really have to look at it from the motivation factor in order to figure out how we want to address it. So I'm going to suspect, and I don't know that much about Georgie, but I'm just kind of going based on the information I have here, that Georgie might be a little bit afraid of hands if he was played with roughly at a young age with little boys who inherently tend to be a little rowdy and rough to begin with. So he might be afraid. So if he's afraid of a hand reaching for him to touch and he's going to respond to bite, then we have to desensitize him to hands and the approach of a hand. So we could do something like starting target training far away with a really long target. Maybe you tape two chopsticks together so the hand's a foot away, and if he orients to the target stick, he gets reinforced for that. Maybe you toss a treat instead, or toss a toy so he can go chase it, and then that gets repeated. And gradually make that target stick a little bit shorter, and a little bit shorter, and a little bit shorter, so he can target your hand. And maybe it says hand with the palm up, and then we start to turn our hand sideways, and then over the top. And maybe we touch him, and then maybe we touch him and stroke a half an inch. Maybe we stroke an inch, and we give one stroke, and session's over, and then gradually increase that to more and more strokes as he remains calm and relaxed and non-reactive in that situation. And this is a scenario where systematic desensitization could be really helpful as long as there's space in fear.
Great. All right, here's another question. What great recommendations do you have for fearful cats?
First and foremost, we have to look at the environment that the fearful cat is in. Can we manage the environment to try to minimize the fear as much as possible? If we can do that, then we start to look at what might be reinforcing for that cat. We're really just going to go through the steps of what we talked about. So, for example, if this is a cat in a shelter, he's in his cage, and he's got a comfortable bed, and he's got a hiding spot, but he's in the back corner of it, and he's a little black cat in the middle of kitten season, his options are limited, right? But what if we start to use some clicker training with some yummy temptation treats or a feline greenie or something like that? And if he furtively glances in the direction of the person in front of him, you click and treat. He might start to think about repeating that behavior. And then he click and treats again as he pokes out. And then maybe we start to teach him the next day that, if you poke around and raise your head up, that's going to get reinforced too. So you can use these exact same techniques that we just talked about to try to coax the cat to try to interact. And that's one of the cool things about clicker training, is that it is so hands-off and it's non-confrontational and it's completely voluntary on the cat's part that a lot of animals that are really, really fearful will actually start to offer behaviors as they learn that this interaction is safe for them to do.
Okay.
Patience is key with kitties.
Great. Let's take another question. What is the most effective way to positively interact with a cat who quickly overstimulates or becomes aggressive?
So this is those kitties that I just think of when I think about frustration, particularly in the shelter. They get overstimulated easy, they become highly aroused, they start to squat and use their claws. And so these types of cats, we want to look at ways that we can interact with them that doesn't involve physical touch. So things I think of these guys are going to be like toys that are on a wand, have a long handle, so the cat's motivated to interact with whatever's at the end of the hand and not you. Fetch is a really, really great game for these guys as well. And I also find that these cats are particularly suited to do clicker training. I call these guys the border collies of the cat world, because when you start clicker training these guys, you're like, whoa, this is the coolest thing ever. Let's keep playing this fun training game because I get to do all this cool stuff and I'm interacting with you. And you can actually maintain the arousal at a reasonable level for a lot of these guys, because using clicker training and teaching cues is a way to help seek impulse control too.
Okay, here's another one, Dr. Bennett. We'll take a few more after this, and then we'll wrap up for the evening. I tried clicker training. I tried clicker training with shy cats. the click was very scary for them. What do you recommend in that case?
So this is something that we run into on occasion, and I would say I actually run into this more with some of the shelter animals than I do with owned pets, and I don't know if it's just because the general level of stress that these animals are under. But sometimes the click is initially quite frightening. It's a loud, novel noise. I'm like, oh my God, what is that? I've got to run and hide. So you can do things like muffling the sound of the clicker so it's not quite so loud. Put it in your hand or your pocket before you click it. If you're sitting, put it in the crook of your knee when you click so it's not quite so loud. Continue to pair it with something amazing. So you really have to know what that cat's absolute favorite reinforcer is. And then sometimes we've even done things like onto a quieter style of clicker, like a button clicker versus a box clicker, or even tried like a pen, a retractable pen. Click the pen open and closed rather than using a clicker because it's a little bit quieter. If that fails, then you can just use a word marker like yes or good instead of a click.
Great answer. We'll take 2 more questions. Here's the second to last. Does returning a timid, maladjusted cat to the shelter environment after working with them in foster care negate their progress, do more harm than good?
So this is an interesting question. When you think about environmental change and you think about cats, I think regardless of the level of adjustment for the cat, changing environments is going to be inherently stressful. So I think about dogs as being more social partner associated, and I think of cats as being more environment associated. They're more bonded with their environment, I think, sometimes than dogs are. So changing environments is going to be stressful, regardless of how you're changing it. Sometimes we don't really have any option. We have a finite amount of time that we can keep an animal in a foster, or we need to put it into the brick and mortar building in order to facilitate adoption if you don't have a really good network set up for fostering or adopting out of your foster setting. I think we have to consider what we can do with that environment that we're putting the cat in to try to minimize the stress and do some things to perhaps make it more familiar. So maybe we take some familiar bedding from the foster home and take it with the cat back to the shelter setting so it's not quite so unfamiliar. But I think just cats in general, if you change their environment, it will be stressful. Ideally, in a perfect world, if I ruled the world, maybe we would just keep these cats in foster care and adopt them out of foster, but we don't always have that as an option.
Okay, here's our last question for the evening. Don't you have to use punishment rather than reward to extinguish undesirable behavior, like covering food dish with objects? So, is that truly punishment or is that management, I would ask? So think about the definition of punishment. You're applying something at that moment to stop the behavior. So if you throw something at the cat or you squirt it with water when it jumps up to that food dish, that's positive punishment. If you simply cover it so the cat can't get to it, or you put something on the countertop that makes it less appealing to lounge on in the sun, that's management. You're simply making the environment less suitable to the cat, so we have to look for other options. So give the cat an alternate resting place, give the cat an alternate source to forage for food, and make the other options less desirable. That's not punishment, that's management. You have to go back and look at the definitions of punishment. It's actually being applied in the moment of that behavior, something that you or some device is being added. Well, that concludes our event this evening. We want to thank Dr. Bennett, and we want to thank all of you for your time. We hope you enjoyed the webcast.